15 licensed cultivators with us over the 2 days, which is a great turnout, being the main members of the Sandcap Association. And the representation comes from across the country, as well as Lesotho. So we have a licensed cultivator from Lesotho. We have cultivators here from Western Cape, Eastern Cape, KwaZulu-Natal, Northern Province, Gauteng, Northwest Province. Who else am I missing here? Sorry? I did say KZN, I think. So thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate the representation and the presence. And yesterday we had a panel discussion around laboratories, around analysis, and a Q&A panel around that. That's on the later end of the production side. But as a licensed cultivator, where do you start? And again, I'm Greg Beadle, CEO of Farmer to Farmer. Our business is focused on helping cultivators generate revenue through the sales of flower and manufactured products. So it interests us as Farmer to Farmer in terms of what genetics are available in the market. And again, as mentioned earlier, is around consistency and compliance of your material. So this panel is going to speak to the genetic side of things. People do ask, what should we grow? Genetics, what does the market want? And my immediate feedback to any licensed cultivator is really saying, well, firstly, what are you happy to grow? Because it's really a chicken and egg model. If we say to a grower, look, you need to grow XYZ from this breeder or nursery, and it doesn't grow well in the facility, then what's the point? So as an open to that, I'm just going to introduce our panel and ask them to each introduce themselves, and we'll get into this meaty topic in terms of genetics. And again, this is an interactive panel, and we'll make time at the end of the panel for questions and interaction between yourselves and the panel. So firstly, I have Bianca Ludolf, who you met in the last presentation on my left, and then Davi Russ and Michael Rosman. Very brief introduction. I'm sure most of you know the majority of the panel, but I'll ask them each to give a short introduction of themselves before we get into the discussion. Thanks. Bianca, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I definitely am opening the floor for taking things beyond the genome, and I get that it's really important to understand genes and how to be able to identify plants. I also really believe that if we have the ability to look at chemotypes and chemovirus, there are genetic information related to that as well that can give us much more in-depth information around something like that.
I'm Davi Russ from Rascal Medicinal Cannabis in Christiana. We've been supplying the potato industry with disease-free genetics since 1993. And currently supplying about 70% of South Africa's disease-free potato material. And for the last 3 years, we've entered into the cannabis space, supplying disease-free genetics to licensed producers in South Africa. We're also supplying dried cannabis flower from our facility, but from our experience in tissue culture and the potato business, it's just a normal spin-off to be able to supply disease-free genetics to the cannabis space.
So my name is Michael, Nexus Bioindustries, and I am a consultant in the biotech and agri-tech business realms. So essentially what I do is I'll go into businesses and help them implement the latest technology and processes for really two reasons: increase profitability. A lot more to it than that, but if I get too far down that route, I'll talk for hours.
Yeah, thanks for the brief introductions. That's great. So look, the first question really is to create the foundation of the discussion is to say, and you'll each get a chance to respond to this, starting with Michael and working backwards, is a quick snapshot. Where are we right now with genetics? We've got an active industry, we've got cultivators growing product, we've got cultivators exporting products, but we're not quite there yet, or we're nowhere near there yet on the genetics, but where exactly are we? So each give us your input of where we are from a genetics frameworking, regulation, consistency standpoint for now.
Yeah, so essentially we're in the infancy from both a genetics and a supply point of view. If I speak firstly for the genetic side, there are a few breeders in the room, and some by my sides here as well, and you compare what's been done on the cannabis industry compared to the agri-industry outside of that, and the technology that's been employed in that we're used to seeing in wheat and potato breeding, compared to what we implement in cannabis. Cannabis is really at its very infancy on it. There's a huge amount of room for improvement, And it's an incredibly exciting time for breeders and biotechnologists such as ourselves. And then from the supply point of view, I think the major topic that we want to get to today on the panel is sort of the standardization and certification of starting material supply, and how that benefits the LPs and growers as a whole, and those starting material suppliers and breeders. So very much in its infancy, a lot of work to be done, and hopefully through SANCAP and through this panel and the people involved, we can start to chip away at it.
Thanks, Michael. You did a good job. I don't have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think increasing is becoming something that's very popular. There's a lot of genetic markers that are being identified that breeders in particular can use. Cannabis is one of the plants that is said to mutate pretty fast, so it's pretty easy to identify new SNPs and identify new markers for breeders.
Okay, now that we're warmed up, we can get into the real points. So what are the risks of carrying on as we are? So we're in the infancy, things are happening, but why do we need to change things? What is the risk of carrying on as we are? Maybe let's work backwards again. Bianca, you can start if you don't mind, please.
Likely a loss of control if we carry on the way. People need to be able to confirm their own identity in terms of the cannabis market as any other market exists out there. And to be able to stand in a reputable business, I think this is a loss of control that we're going to head for if we don't set out a framework.
Thanks, Bianca. I think the biggest risk, if we carry on like we are doing now, is the risk of disease, specifically hops-latent viroid, and then also genetic purity, to be able to produce what the customer wants, and the strain that you want is actually the strain that you get, and that's where the DNA testing comes in, and we'll, I think, talk about that some more. But I think the number one thing is to be able to be sure that you've got disease-free material to carry your production out.
Yeah, so very interesting. I think building on further from that, and almost looking from Jackie, you mentioned the forgotten element of things, the customer down approach, is the reputation damage that can incur from this, where I doubt there's a single person in this room that hasn't come into contact with the problem that we have in the industry, where, let's say, you've been supplying Gorilla Glue into your customers for years, and suddenly now there's those customers have grown to accept this, and this helps me. This is the strain that I know and love, and there might be another Gorilla Glue on the market, advertise the same thing, and suddenly that customer now thinks, this doesn't work for me. And there's, at the moment, no standardization, no accepted standardization practice for that, and I think that it's going to take a long time until this is something that's taken up by legislatory bodies, but it's something that we can start focusing on now as an association, and start putting those things in place.
Thanks, Michael. And I mean, from my point of view, it seems like we have a lot of the tools in place, like Bianca's shown us in her presentation, from what Michael can contribute, Darby's experience. And even, I mean, there's a Swiss producer who has mapped out the whole genome of the cannabis plant, 8 million different traits the cannabis plant has. Now, a trait, for example, is high in THC or mold resistant, or 8 million variants. So it's a complex. As we know, we haven't even don't even know how many terpenes there are in the cannabis plants, or metabolites, even as an example. So there's a lot of work being done in the background, a lot of research. How do we, as an association, best set this framework in place to regulate the industry for genetics going forward? So I'm going to ask Darby to start with that one, and then go Michael and Bianca.
Thanks, Greg. I don't think we must redesign the wheel. We must look at how other countries that's got something in place, how they do it. I think John probably looked at Canada maybe, and we must build on what we have in other industries and adapt it to our own conditions. And I think South Africa, we one of the most important suppliers of cannabis in the world because of our climate, our cost, etc. And we really need to be in the forefront of supplying, as Mike said, and Jackie, what the patient wants is what they get. And I think Mike has got some ideas on that. I'm going to pass the buck again.
Yes, I think very well summed up there. And the part about not inventing the wheel again is very important, because this has been done on almost every other agricultural crop out there on the market, where there are certifications and standards that nursery suppliers have to hit, and the cultivators will look for that. And it makes life a lot easier for those cultivators to be able to say, you know what, they've got the certification, therefore they can be trusted, rather than going through what many of us have gone through, which is the trial and error and the huge expense that comes with. So what we will do is we'll look to the frameworks that are there, adapt them to the cannabis industry, because it has its unique challenges and points that we need to adjust for. But the idea that we're formulating as an association is a bolt-on framework. So rather than a whole nother audit, it's an audit specifically for the nurseries and breeders that would apply a sort of internal certification. It's obviously a lot of work and a long way to go with it, but we're chipping away and well underway in getting that concept rolling forward.
So just, sorry, to hold it with you, Mike, so just to break that down to layman terms for my benefit, what you're proposing or suggesting that the association should do is have an audit in place for nurseries who'd like to become a part of SANCAP, to create a framework to protect the interest of the cultivators, that when they source genetics, they know what they're getting, it's a trusted source, and there'll be a consistent, compliant supply of genetics for their business.
Exactly. So that includes everything from genetics, your virus testing, which is something that is, believe it or not, seldom done properly, all the way through to just ensuring that those nurseries have full track and trace and are compliant with their own SAPRA regulations, and then taking it really much further than that into the nitty-gritty, and making sure that from that point of view, their clients are going to be getting the most consistent and best product that is possible in the market. And then that has that trickle-on effect where the reputation can only benefit from an international point of view looking to South Africa.
Yeah, I think it cuts both ways. If we as cultivators or genetic producers or nurseries adhere to certain standards that we want to draft, then our customers must also adhere to this ethics and protect our genetics, not to give it out to Pity behind the KFC and his chommy and just to protect our genetics, because we are spending a lot of money on it. We're spending money developing new genetics, breeding, etc. And if SANCAP members can adhere to a code of conduct both ways, then I think we're going to make huge progress.
I might be jumping ahead here, but I mentioned earlier that the breeding side of things in cannabis is very much in its infancy. And a large part of that is because the OPEX and CAPEX that is required to run a full marker-assisted breeding program is high. And at the moment, there's no real incentive for that to happen, because it is so easy for these genetics to change hands, and that's the nature of the industry as it is. So it's going to become increasingly important to make sure that those breeders and genetic suppliers are protected in that way, which then incentivizes them to push the boundaries and start creating better and better products, and that benefit then filters on.
No, that's great information. Thank you. And as you say, there's representation here from the breeder side point of view as well as from nursery point of view. And the framework has to look at both breeders and the nurseries. I mean, I know some companies, they can put markers in place where you can cross a flower of theirs 10 times and they can still pick up markers in the plant. Are you seeing that? I mean, I guess the question from that is, how do we regulate that? Like Davy says, taking the flower and give it to Pity behind the farm gate. How do we not police it, but how do we protect the interest of the members of SANCAP by making sure we can regulate the fair distribution? What are the different models that are available, and how do we manage those models best?
So I think I can talk to the genetic side of things, and then Davy, you can chat about more how that's sort of implemented and the things we have to stick to. But in terms of tracking your strain, believe it or not, is rather simple. There are a number of companies out there that will provide everything from a marker identification system all the way through to full genome sequencing, which gives you even more information about your plant. And that genetic element of things is irrefutable. So like you were saying, some of the companies out there that have developed these markers that are incredibly stable, and you can actually track that plant down through subsequent crosses and parental lines. And so that's how we establish where the plants are going. In terms of then how we protect that, that really falls to within the association. We'd like that to be protected within a sort of government framework, but we're not there yet. So we have to look at that from an internal point of view. And I think, I'm saying a bit more now, but that's where we need to step in. And Davi mentioned sort of code of ethics, which is what SANCAP already has in place, as far as I know, where we all sign that and adhere to best business practice. And it trickles on from there. And I think that it's up to us to sort of set the standards for best business practice and ethics in that, where it only benefits everyone at the end of the day. How we go about that, from putting that into action and a more realistic framework, is still something that we need to iron out, and something that we'd like to receive a lot of the input from the members themselves. So this becomes a collaborative effort rather than a sort of rule-setting endeavor.
Yeah, I think Mike said it all. We can have agreements and thick sales agreements, etc. And if it gets broken, like it has been done, it's just the lawyers that gets rich on it. We do have our own facility, do have DNA markers, and we tested all our strains. We've got it in a database. So we can, if we suspect something that's alienated, we can go and take a sample. We can even test dried flour, and it can be traced back to the DNA database that we've already done. So, but we really don't want to play policemen. We want all to adhere to ethics. You will soon learn about your customers, who you can trust, who you can't trust. I think it's in its infancy, and I'd love to see something drafted that's beneficial to all of us.
I often wonder, when we look at government bodies, whether there is not, because there's this delineation between terminologies, hemp and cannabis and marijuana, and everything refers to something different, could have those types of terminologies actually just solidly understood. And when you want to delineate, I mean, I know we want a fingerprint and we want to understand and track our plants back via DNA. To regulate the compliance or the legal aspects of it, can we not, without rewriting a framework, look at chemotypes and separate things that way on the basis of its chemical composition and its chemical profile? Would it not make legal regulatory aspects easier if we can separate those two?
Yeah, I can add to that. So Bianca and I actually went through at the IPB together, so I know her work quite well. And I think what you're alluding to there is your work on identifying individuals based on their chemotype. So this is something that we're looking to integrate as a supplement to the genetic testing. Ultimately, we can test for the DNA, but what's important to every one of us is the secondary metabolites, which includes your THC, your CBD. That's what makes it financially viable for all of us to be in this industry. So tracking that as well as the genetic element is going to be very important.
Good. Look, I have a personal saying that trust is like an elastic band. It only stretches so far, but once that elastic band is broken, the trust is broken. So I think it comes back to SANCAP standing for a circle of trust, or a brand of trust, that if you belong to the SANCAP association, the intention is that the members of the association can be trusted. How does that get regulated? Is that through signing a code of ethics? Should you transgress or be proven to transgress any ethics or legal part of that, there will be repercussions. It's not a threat, it's not a police effort, it's what we stand for as an association, as we don't stand for anything. coming together as the main members being licensed cultivators. So I think it's a fair point there on that side, quite hard to police, but we've got to have some trust between us that we're all here to do the right business. As Darby says, you learn quickly who you can trust and who you can't trust. So just to step in a different lane, just in terms of tissue culture and cloning, we've had a couple of discussions just randomly the last 2 days, great discussions, but around preserving genetics. So, some cultivators may bring in their own genetics and own those genetics for themselves. How do they best protect that IP in terms of forward future genetics? And when it comes to offering your clients, and this might be a bit basic for the audience now, but for those people who might not be aware, tissue culture versus cloning, what are you offering in terms of services from Darby's aspect as well as from Mike?
I think we'll all fight over this answer because we're all tissue culture experts in some way or another. I think perhaps then I'll tackle it from two perspectives, and then we can add on it, where there's the physical protection, where you're isolating that genetic, that IP from outside influence, so from pests, from diseases and that type of thing. That's where tissue culture comes in. And then there's the legal protection, the IP side of things. The IP protection is very much more complicated. From there, we sort of have to look at plant breeders' rights, which Ben, you and I have these discussions quite a lot, where it seems in South Africa, in terms of the office here, it is on hemp, not on cannabis. Okay, that's fine. How then, outside of that framework, do we protect our IP? And that again starts with genetics, just simply by identifying those plants. Then we get into the argument of what makes a unique strain, and we need to define that, because what we don't want is this rush to now register IP that is out there in the market as yours, but you didn't create it. And how do we set that out? I think there's a lot to be discussed there, and again, the idea is to weigh in on the regulations and frameworks that are already in place, either in other countries or on other agricultural products within South Africa. And that's essentially what we're hoping to do within SANCAP as a whole. So in terms of services and the actual benefits, perhaps, Davy, I mean, you're more in on this at the moment than I am. Do you want to add to that?
Mrs. No, man, these things are all dead and it doesn't grow and whatever. So we don't we don't like to supply tissue culture because we don't have any control of how it's treated since it leaves our facility. So we rather make mother plants of that and supply the customers cuttings of that first mother from tissue culture. And we do it, although we only accept disease-free material, we test and get it tested. We don't test ourselves. We send it off to a third to test. That's our business in disease-free material. So it must be tested. Only accept it as disease-free. It gets tested and then verified before sending it out.
Yeah, I think it's a key point, Darby, is control of disease. I've heard numerous stories across the years of products moving between facilities without quarantines in the good old days, but bad old days. But it's a key aspect of. Look, I think it's one last question for the panel, then we'll open up for questions before lunch. I hear some rumbling stomachs. As a genetic supplier, I mean, there are a couple of genetics out there in the market that are proven to be popular. Many cultivators are growing similar suppliers. How do you, as a distributor of genetics, decide on, do you stick to what's popular right now, or how do you offer a diversified offering that keeps it fresh? Where do you look for trends, and how do you try and keep current in terms of interacting with the clients, getting their feedback, etc.?
Yeah, Greg, I'll start off with, and again, what does the patient want? And we find out from our customers what they want, and we import new genetics. It's not easy. From one company, we've signed an agreement with another. Hopefully, within the next few months, we'll have more strains coming in. We only work with tissue culture, our business. We don't import any seeds. It's I think consumer driven, and we have to supply what the consumer wants.
Yeah, I think sort of following on from that, you said it all. But so many times I have clients that will spot a strain that their grower thinks is fantastic and they want to grow, and I think all of us are sort of guilty on that front in one way or another. because we're all passionate about these plants at the end of the day. But it is so important to work from the top down, or backwards from this case, where you look at your customer and what's trending. The difficulty there, and I'm sure, Greg, you've also come into contact, is that there is a lag to that. So what the customer wants now, they're only really going to receive much later. And so you almost have to have a predictive mindset on that. And the industry being as volatile can be quite difficult to do. So in instances like that, I do always recommend the people like yourself, Greg, who are involved in the industry and most in touch with the customers directly, to really get a track on what that might be. Really important.
Thanks for that feedback. I'm sure there must be some questions. Jackie, let's go to Jackie first.
Thanks to the panel. It's really informative. My question is entry, but because you said it's in an infancy stage, and so I'm from a SAPRA perspective, right from one of their requirements, in order for them to have some sort of a compliance tick box, so to speak, I say it loosely, is that they were asking for a phytosanitary. So what is your standing and what is your response to that? Obviously, we're way advanced in this conversation than a phytosanitary certificate, but that's kind of where we are in the infancy with SAPRA. So how can we advise, as SANCAP, advise them where they should be catching up?
Brilliant question. I have lost count, I'm sure you have as well, the amount of times that I've been asked this from a buyer point of view. It is valid for 10 days. So, and that's normally only issued when you have plant material crossing borders. So the misconception there comes in where what SAPRA intended was that all strains coming into, all starting material was to come into the country. It didn't start here, which we all know is now a bit of a backwards way of looking. The general consensus now with SAPRA is that it's okay as long as you can show a traceable look on that, and it's coming from a licensed site who then can also show it. So we're pushing that a little bit further down the line, and there's a lot to be done there in terms of those legislatory changes. The consensus from SAPRA during my few talks with them is that they know it's an issue, they would love to change it, and like you were saying, Jackie, they just don't have the manpower or the time or the fund. So how can then we, as the people in this, work with that and around that?
Yeah, I think Mike said it all, and Jackie, that's a fantastic question, and I would love the answer to that. Does SAPRA accept anything that did not cross the border into South Africa in a legal way? Do they accept it?
Can I answer? Is it a hypothetical or can I answer?
Sorry, we didn't hear.
Davy, is that a hypothetical or may I answer just from experience? So background experience is a phytosanitary certificate that had a Spanish stamp on it that came from a US supplier was accepted as a phytosanitary certificate or a 5 year ago site from professional experience.
Cool. Let's just be aware here, if we start down this road with SAPRA, if I must say, SAPRA's job is a regulator for the industry. It's a job that's very hard to do and underutilized resource. So the mistakes that happen, but maybe let's keep that a separate conversation. Later, we need to enable industry ourselves. We can just keep that level there. Thanks.
Any other questions, guys?
Chris from Cure. This question's, I'd like your input, Bianca, going on the chemotype regulatory aspect that you were. Being a geneticist, I've always felt that genetic freedom is important, and at the same time, we need to look at regulation. If we look at India, for instance, and their food security model on the rice model, the more they focused on an increase in genetic freedom, the higher food security and the lower the risk. So if we regulate genotype, that's easy to regulate. As soon as we get to the point of regulating chemotype, it becomes difficult, specifically in this industry, I think, because of elements like convergent evolution, where you may have two crosses to a similar chemotype and to red breeding, if I could say it like that. Because in other industries, you don't really get convergent evolution to the same point that you can almost patent. So do you feel, in a sense, that regulating chemotype could almost lead to regulatory risk in overregulation, or what are your views on that?
That's a good point. I mean, obviously, you don't want to be interested in chemovar and chemotyping is because ultimately this is the end product that we are looking towards. And every plant that we grow, the outcome of that plant is a plants that we wanted to make. I think if we can use that as a comp to the genotyping in terms of regulation, that would be a good way to go forward with, because what I have found with the genes is sometimes you can see mutations and sometimes things happen in the then you can still, based on the genotype, this is my plant, which is all fair and well, but the end user, the customer, is complaining because the chemovar was not what was said it was meant to be. So the kinds of regulations I'm looking towards, because we can say we are growing our plants controlled, etc., with this humidity, that temperature, but something goes wrong for one day and your crop can actually be compromised in terms of its chemical profile. So if we can move forward using genotyping and chemotyping hand in hand, and perhaps that might be, that's my reasoning going forward, using both of these things as a complement.
I agree with that 100%. Just the concern then would say if somebody registered that cultivar or chemotype, if somebody else did a breeding project, used two different alpha betas, made the F1, and then that F1 had a similar chemotype, they would be kicked out of the market just because they can't bring that chemotype to market.
But then you must also still have your genotype, right? You can't just, based on a chemotype, that it's yours. You're bringing the backing of your genomic, your metabolomic, and all these kinds of scientific facets into the breeder, into the IP policies and rights. So definitely not only focused on the chemical.
Okay, excellent. Thanks.
Hi there, it's Mark here from Repair by Nature. Just for plants, I think there's confusion among some cultivators and an assumption that putting a variety through the tissue culture process is a foolproof way of eliminating pathogens, specifically viruses. Could you guys explain the difference between, for example, nodal versus meristematic tissue culture and methods of these different processes and how it can be applied to the cannabis industry?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's a good question, and I think Mike will be probably more qualified to answer it. But as far as I've got it, meristem culture is the only way to get rid of disease if you've got a disease. If you only do nodal cuttings, and if there's maybe an obsolete viral, it could be transmitted again. To get rid of it, you need to go with meristem culture.
Yeah, and I can add to that. So you're bang on there. It's not foolproof. So I do this and have set this up for a number of clients. It is a huge expense facility because they then have to accept diseased material. So this is something that you have to set up in your own facility. So you really have to be committed to it and still understand the guarantee that you'll be able to get the virus out. The other method that is one that I always try first is also heat treatment. So you get your plants into tissue culture first, and then you hold them at a temperature in the same way as when we get we have a temperature. Same thing happens. It's just that plants hate it even more than we do. So your chance of getting a living plant out is very, very low. If you can, that's a much cheaper and easier way. The meristem tissue culture is incredibly time consuming, not just in terms of the manner. For cannabis, it is a very, very long. So it can be done, and it can be considered foolproof in the way that if you do it enough and are prepared to spend enough time, enough money on it, you're more than likely going to be successful. But that comes down to how much are you willing to spend on saving that specific strain.
Great, thank you. Any other questions?
Good. I want to say thank you to the panel. So basically, compliance, according to the one you used, was commitment, I think a lot more pigs than chickens in the room. So on that note, thanks to the panel. Let's go for lunch.